and hopefully you can hear us. And so today's panel is a little bit of a wet dream for me. I remember years.
I have been called that.
And what
I've been called that many times. Who's going to tell us?
And as you can see, this is in no way going to be a respectable panel or one that makes coherent sense throughout. But very women. No, you're not behaving like yourselves.
Neelika is very badly behaved.
No, she's putting lipstick on.
Okay.
I am, but I'm not a lipstick.
I feel like I have like a Robin Williams here. I'm trying to control them, and it's not going to happen very well. But so I'm going to try to attempt some questions. And this is really the launch of a project that's NRF funded called Art on Our Mind. It's influenced, it takes its title from the Bell Hooks book, Art on My Mind. And it was a book that really influenced me about the potential of creative theorization and how Bell Hooks uses the visualities of our culture to theorize around our lives. Now, of course, she's not the only one that does that, and she's not the first to do it, but she was my introduction to that field. And I was, of course, introduced to that field by Betty Govinden. So it's really awesome to have a mentor of 20-odd years ago. So now you're getting
From the 16th century.
so now you're getting a bit of a dating here. I'm sure some of you can identify. I was alone as a student. I mean, I was literally alone as a student. My program closed. And they tried to force us out of the department, and they managed to move 70 kids, but not me. So I was literally the only student in the department. And so a lot of the problems that I thought I was experiencing, like I was really feeling stupid and grappling with MA research, but also the sense that I really didn't fit into feminism. That was where my research was going, but more Western feminism I read. Instead of finding a home there, I felt more alienated. And then I saw one day a poster at UDW that said, Patricia Hill Collins, Black Feminist Epistemology, and I'd missed this talk. And I was like, so I went up to the Faculty of Education and I knocked on the door, and well, maybe you guys are a different generation, so you are bold, but I was terrified, because I was pretty convinced that I was like really stupid at that time. And so I knocked on the door, and Betty was there, and she let me in, and we started talking, and I was telling her the problems that I was having. She knew my supervisor, and she said, send me your research. And so she actually read my research and started to give me feedback, and she has been a mentor for over 20-odd years, along with my other supervisor, and they still write recommendations for me, yeah? Which is fantastic. And this is the spirit in which this conference as well, this colloquium has been done, that as women we support each other. As Black women we support each other. It's a fundamental support network that influences every aspect of our lives. And we can write about it in these kind of linear ways, but it never captures the vastness of it and how much our lives are run by this kind of network. And so it's wonderful to be here with this network of people. I think it was like 2009, I was a secretary for someone because I couldn't get a job in the art world with 2 MA degrees. And I sat and I wrote this conference about creative methodologies. And I wrote out all the people that I wanted. And I'm glad to say that some of these were at the top of my list, along with Bell Hooks and Patricia Hill Collins.
Unfortunately, couldn't make it.
We're trying for next year. The only person that's missing is Desiree Lewis, who I would also have loved to have had here, but she's pretty crazy. And so I'm going to introduce the rest of our panelists. And so the Art on Our Mind project is a project that's funded by the NRF over the next 3 years. We also have some Mellon funding for students as well that we have co-opted into this. And so over the next 2-3 years, what we do is every 2 to 3 months, we invite a South African woman of color artist here. Our group would have spent that 2 or 3 months researching her work, her influences, her inspirations, and then we will have a public talk with her. Not just about like her hardships and her biography, But you know, like about her influences, about her working methodologies, about her creative strategies, you know, kind of like all the other stuff she does, right? And this is like super wonderful, right? Because in South Africa, we are utterly blessed with the most amazing women of color artists who don't do it for the money, because there's virtually none at times, but they do it for the love, and they do it so well. But unfortunately, discourse, academia has been lacking. So the most you ever get about of them is short catalog write-ups and little blurbs in the newspapers, and those academic articles have been missing for quite a while, especially articles and discourse emanating from scholars within the visual art and art history field. And in that time, in that vacuum, people like Pumla, Gqola, Yvette Abrams, and Desiree Lewis has stood in that gap for us when we didn't have scholars in our own field who was doing that, and Betty and Daisy Pillay. And so they've actually, Yvette was speaking a little bit later about how weird it is that we're referencing works of hers from the 90s when she's done so much else since then. But that work continues to resonate, as does Pumla's work, all through these years. And if you ever see my class of students when I do black feminist creative methodologies with them, yeah, you'd understand how powerful those texts are. And that's the wonderful thing about academia and discourse. They never date, just, we do, right? So this is going to be a very loose panel. This is going to be the kind of panel that sets up our entire project, because our entire project is about the power of creative theorization. Okay? And somebody mentioned a little bit earlier, yes, there's all these kind of feminists who we read their theory, but then they have these works, these creative fictional works that they've also done that we don't pay attention to them. Can't we apply the critical thinking from the theory into that creative fiction as well? But it's not about applying critical thinking to that. That creativity is critical thinking, and that relationship back and forth. And so I'm going to ask a series of questions, but we're going to have a dialogue around it. Some people have prepared answers, some people have not, and some people are very nervous about that, and other people are not. I think Neelika is going to get a lot of flack from Pumla as we proceed, but that's per course, I see. So I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to kind of just get into it. I hope those at the back can hear. Okay. If you can't, then you need us to kind of raise our voice, just tell us, né? Okay. So let me start off with my mentor, Betty Govinden. She's an education and literature scholar, a poet. She's the author of Sister Outsiders. She's done a lot of work around the South African Indian community, particularly around feminist practices. But you're also a noted education scholar as well. I kind of forget that sometimes. And she'll be actually giving us a bit of poetry later on in our performance segment. Neelika Jayawardane is an English literature scholar based in New York. And again, it's actually kind of weird because nobody sitting here is from the visual arts field. So it really does goes to show about the people who have held the gap for us in the meantime. And Neelika is one of those people. And what I love, I've actually never read any of your English stuff. She engages a lot of artists from across the continent, and
works in photography.
yes, and she does a lot of work on photography, particularly South African photography. You're working on something on Afropix right now. Is that correct? Yeah. What I love about Neelika's work is that she's always incredibly generous with artists. And I love that kind of generosity that in which she engages South African artists, particularly South African women of color artists. Yvette Abrams is a feminist scholar, but she's also more, in the last 20 years, moved into economics, into food and food policies and environmental, but tied to food politics, right? And she's also started Cool Life, is that right? Am I saying it right?
Queer life.
Queer Life. And she's producing a movie right now. She says she was supposed to have written a book under the injunction of Pumla, but she hasn't. So she's created a movie, and we're gonna just see a bit of that right now.
Ooh.
As an intro to Yvette. It's short, people, so you only have to strain for a little while.
Yeah, that's very short.
Okay, play. At the back.
You have to improve your own life. Man, there is nothing for me that I didn't do for myself. He was in prison. What can he do for me when he was in prison? What can Joe do for me that I did for myself?
Welcome to Queer Life YouTube silk making videos. My name is Yvette. I am the creative silk maker in charge, and today I'm going to be showing you how I make love in the midst of climate change silk. This is a silk that Queer Life has designed to help raise funds for a documentary entitled Love in the Midst of Climate Change. The making of this documentary is important because it shows the intersectionality in the lives of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in adverse circumstances. I am one of those people. With Cape Town dams as an all-time low, we must act now to save our water, and here on the farm we want to do our small part in this action. Love in the Midst of Climate Change soap is a three-color soap: white, green and black. All the colors are a mixture of shea butter, coconut oil and olive oil with soap wood added to soften your skin. I know it. You know, that is soap. The heart of the soap, which is black, is given texture to represent the soil. This is done with activated charcoal. Activated charcoal opens pores and absorbs toxins created by pollution. When I use natural ingredients, this cuts the use of fossil fuels and reduces the carbon emissions associated with producing soap. The way I design my product is to reduce carbon emissions even further by using a solar cooker and a solar water heater we installed here on the farm. Putting all of this together means not only a fantastic soap, but a chance to help the climate regain its balance after over-drilling and over-mining of our natural resources. The first thing I do is make the green leaves by steeping coconut oil in annatto seed to make yellow. I then pick soapwood from the garden and extract the juice, which I freeze, ready for use. I add indigo powder to the lye water and some green oxide to the oils. When all this is mixed together, it makes a lively color-fast green for our leaves. I prepare the molds by rubbing in olive oil on the inside of the mold so the bars don't stick when I take them out for the final glazing. Now I'm going to pour the soap. a look at the label of your soap. If you can't pronounce the ingredients, should you really be putting that on your skin? Your soap might change your life and save the environment. Queer Life motto is saving our skin and the environment, one bar of soap at a time. You can contribute by liking this YouTube video. You can donate money by buying bars of soap or direct to our website, commonmindsmedia.com.
So, as we were speaking about earlier, it's good and great to be, critically aware and self-reflexive, but you need to also put that into activism. So, some sponsor that worthwhile cause. Buy some soap or just donate money towards it. And of course, next is someone, when I was doing my first MA and I was reading these articles and I was like quoting, Gqola said this, Gqola said that. Gqola. Okay. And then years later, then I kind of, somebody is like, oh and Dineo's coming, and then I end off at this dinner or something, and then I realized it's Pumla, Dineo, Gqola. And I was like, oh dear God. So I tried to act all cool, and I've still been trying to act all cool for many, many years right now. But it's really awesome to have Pumla here because her work and her motto has really been invested in creative theorization. For me, she's really a forerunner in South Africa of this kind of thinking, where she has been actively engaging visual artists and literary scholars and musicians and performers in writing feminist theory out of their practices. So not just theory influencing practices, and those of us in visual arts know this all the time. We read all these theories and it goes into our making and it influences ideas, but also how practice itself, how the things we do are the sites of theorization as well. Her work has been very influential. And so, when I just recently started teaching art history, and my students, actually, we hardly ever look at art history texts. What we do look at is the kind of works of these women who have been writing, and now the buzzword is decolonization, but Black feminist and African feminist and race theories have at the heart been decolonial. So while decoloniality is a buzzword right now, you cannot be an African feminist or a Black feminist if you don't have decolonial agendas and imperatives. And so, of course, Pumla is a professor in African literature at Wits, and she is the author of several books, and apparently she's launching one in the next few weeks. I'm sure there's like communications people from Rhodes here because they're like trying to get that. So, Pumla, I hope you're just going to say something, a little promo about your book when it's coming out, if possible. Yeah, why not?
Yes.
You're launching it like in the next 2 or 3 weeks, right?
Oh. Okay, I was going to say something about Yvette, so I'm a bit taken off guard.
No, you're going to pick on Yvette.
No, I was going to say Yvette's soap.
Saved my skin.
Yvette's soap comes also in range of colors and fragrances, and so she only showed you one, and I've been using them for years, and I strongly recommend them. Although when she first started making them, I was one of the few friends who gave her a hard time about how there was no foam, and she kept saying, "Who says you need foam? You need to decolonize." But eventually, we wore her down, and now there is foam. So I strongly recommend them. They are great for the skin, and they smell good. And they do all the other lefty stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so about my new book is called Reflecting Rogue Inside the Mind of a Feminist. I'm never going to write a memoir, ever. So forget about it. But my publisher is hoping that one day she'll weigh me down. It's my most autobiographical book to date. I don't know what else I'm supposed to say. It
When-
comes out in the next few days, but the first, officially, it hits bookstores at the end of next week. The first launch for the is the Joburg launch on the 10th of August. And then I'm going to do a Reflecting Road campus tour, which means university campus tour, mainly because I've just been so energized by the kind of young generation of feminists on university campuses. I don't know what else you want me to say.
It's an intellectual.
I'm going to stop there.
It's an intellectual reflection of your work, which I prefer because I think that women are expected to write memoir about their painful experiences and how they came to be, and we're supposed to expose it.
Absolutely. No, there isn't much pain, but there is a bit of scandal.
Is there some Stella got a group back?
There is a bit of...
Stella got
Got a group back.
No, maybe. I don't know. You have to buy the book to find out what kind of
She went to
scandal.
the Caribbean.
There's a little bit
Yeah,
of...
no, they're very young. They don't know Stella got a
Yes, they don't know what we're talking about. No, there's no Stella. Not really. I don't know. You must look.
She's setting up.
So we're gonna
Thank you, Neelika, for selling my book. Please listen to what she said by the book. If it's not in there, I'm sorry. It's fine.
Okay, we're going to start off with a question that doesn't just assume that because you are here at the African Feminist Conference that you're an African feminist. And so I want to, and I've spoken briefly about how so many of us as women of color come to feminism and feel so dissatisfied with it that we do not find a home in it, and we go searching for other alternatives. And so, at least since the 60s, there's been, well, longer than that. We have Audre Lorde speaking to a room full of women in the 1800s saying, well, clearly you are not recognizing the fact that I'm also a woman, according to your kind of your feminist principles.
Sojourner Truth. Yeah.
Okay, it's because we like her so much.
Audre Lorde is good for anything. Copy and paste, yes, sorry. Sojourner Truth. And so, my question, and so at least since the 60s, there's been women of color who have come to feminism and have been dissatisfied with it and have created alternatives to it. Whereas someone like Bell Hooks has been very clear that we should not splinter the feminist movement and that we need to claim that space. And so what I want to ask each of you is, what is your perception of what we currently call feminism or feminisms? And what is your relation to the concept of feminism at the moment? And is there a specific name you call your feminism? Anyone can start.
I wanted to start with this book, and I brought my notes as a crutch, Pumla. This book's 50 Shades of Feminism, and I recommend that you read it. And here, there are many shades of feminism, and feminism is changing. I'm old enough to know how feminism is changing over the decades. But I think at the center of feminisms, however we define it, is an agenda of protest, an agenda of critical thinking. And I wanted to just quote one of the shades. So it's 50 shades of feminism, but it's 50 shades of red when you're thinking of feminism. Not grey, that in between yuppie hue of prevarication, indecision, and relativism. Feminism has colored the red of women's rage, women's despair, women's power, women's brilliance, and women's ability to survive. It is the lifeblood of emancipation, which pulses with never-ending faith that freedom and justice are only ever a heartbeat away.
Well, I think that mostly I wanted to say that unless other movements around other political issues, whatever that other political issue is, include women's perspectives and women's presence and their voices and their ideas and their experiences, that agenda is essentially limited and limiting to all of us. I don't think that women should be in the service of liberation movements that do not liberate them and do not in fact call on men to liberate themselves from the shackles of seeing women as support systems, editorial help, cooks, drivers to airports, you name it. Along with that, we are in a moment when we're finally discussing the realities about the fact that there's no such thing as a gender binary. The things that I learned in endocrinology class, my background is in microbiology, because this is what I was studying when I did my first degree. Those are things that were already researched and, already known, that we have endocrinology systems that we're born with that complicate what gender we are. And physical bodies that we're born with that are far more complex than male or female. And unless we have feminisms and movements that include these complicated ways of being, which are really very beautiful ways of being. Sometimes I'm attracted to certain women, sometimes I'm attracted to certain men, sometimes people look beautiful. My affections go many places, even if my sexuality doesn't go there. If we can include those thoughts without finding them threatening, then we have a feminism that I'm there for.
Pumla and I, we had this discussion many years, a couple of decades ago almost. Two decades ago. Where, I would call myself an African womanist, and she and Des would call themselves black feminists. And one day I was like, Pumla, why? Why black feminism? And she goes, because black comes first. I was like, okay. And so ever since then, I've sort of always called myself an African womanist stroke black feminist, because that made perfect sense. You see that the African and the black still comes first. And for me, I think that's ideologically important. That said, I have huge reservations. Is it too early to get into reservations? Around the price that feminism has paid to become academically respectable, and the ways in which the movement had to straighten its hair, even to build women and gender studies departments, or to become a recognized academic field of study. So for the longest, I then spent about 15 years only reading lesbian separatism from the mid-1980s, the period just before we became queer, and we were still lesbian, it was still okay to be separatist, because I just couldn't get what came afterwards. I'd be like, okay, so if you're queer on the street, I don't understand your word you're saying, and I've got a PhD. Now, if you're queer on the street, don't get it, how is it feminist? If they don't even understand it. And so that's why I quite deliberately, and the older I get, become more and more alienated from the academy, or should I say, the academy has become more alienated from me. Now, I want to say this in a non-judgmental way. I think it's necessary to have feminists on the inside as well as on the outside. I think the work they do is incredibly important. I take my hat off to all of you that have managed to survive it reasonably intact. But how many times can you say Foucault in the given working day before your sanity starts to give way?
The fabric of the universe starts tearing apart. Say Foucault one more time.
And okay, maybe my experience was extreme. I was the only black woman in Department of History at University of Cape Town for many years. And we used to have these staff meetings where they argue about who's going to get what office. And I was like, I'm not doing this. There's got to be something bigger than this. So maybe that was extreme, But I do still think that we need to question what is the relationship between feminism within the academy and the broader women's movement outside. I've quite literally read, there was this one article, Agenda on food, for instance, where the academic author was criticizing the women in the food movement for not being feminist enough. And I go, okay, so feminism is what the middle class feminist defines it to be. And I do think she used Foucault to define it, by the way. So I'm like, the fact that it passes peer review and gets into an academic journal kind of shows you where we have landed. And so yes, like Pumla, your fees must fall kids give me immense joy. I'm so pleased that activism has gotten back to universities. Okay, in many ways it never really left in like black uni, but you know, it's hit the mainstream in very interesting ways. But I still find soap a better means of communication with the masses of women than post-coloniality. I challenge anybody to translate post-Derrida into an indigenous language.
Okay, so, are you done, Yvette?
I'm done, darling.
Okay, so I started calling myself a feminist when I was 15. And I will die calling myself a feminist. And sometimes I qualify it, and sometimes I don't qualify it.
Yeah.
But I also believe that all feminisms are qualified. There's no feminism that isn't qualified, right? So we're all different kinds of feminists. And sometimes we foreground what the qualification is for whatever the work is we try to do in that very moment, and other times we don't. But, you know, I think there's no such thing as just feminism full stop. I think also, I mean, and so why did I start calling myself a feminist when I was 15? I started calling myself a feminist when I was 15 because I found enormous pleasure in discovering this word that describes something I already was, right? So I didn't come to feminism at 15. I found the word. Yeah. And the word was important to me because it linked me to a range of, I was like, what? I'm not just one crazy person with my 5 friends. There's millions of other crazy girls and women and other people, you know, gender non-conforming. Okay, I didn't know gender non-conforming. I didn't know the word gender non-conforming. I'm not gonna, you know, was not that woke at 14. So I thought I cherished, and I still do, the enormous value that word has in connecting me to people who are interested, to millions of other people in the world, who speak millions of other languages, who want to create the kind of world that I want to live in. So that's why I don't, you know, I've called myself feminist unapologetically since then. I suppose like every movement, I think that I don't need all of us to do our feminism in exactly the same kinds of ways. I think that, of course, we're going to disagree and sometimes we're going to fight. And I think that's the risk you take when you're in movement. And I think that we are able to do different kinds of work and need to be able to do different kinds of work. So for me, feminism is about changing the world. Feminism is also, of course, about pleasure, right? And I'm unapologetic about that, right? Not just the sexual pleasure that too. I completely believe in erotic justice, unapologetically, right? I believe in erotic justice unapologetically. I believe in entitlement to pleasure, unapologetically, sexual pleasure included. But I don't just mean sexual pleasure. And so I think, and for me, there is enormous pleasure in being part of feminist community, and in being part of different feminist communities. And there's enormous pleasure in being a feminist professor, and I'm not going to apologize for it. And I'm not going to apologize for the fact that I'm able to and choose to do different kinds of feminist work in different places. As someone who speaks 7 languages, for me, this is not even an issue, right? That's what you do. You speak differently in different places, and you derive pleasure, and you fight in different languages. It's just the thing that you do. And I understand that conceptually, this is a difficult thing for people who speak one language, right? Because you have to, like, you have this coherent sense of self. But when you speak 7 languages and 5 of them fluently, the sense of a self that is malleable is not something that is like, that you have to learn in a theory class. It's just part of how you live in the world, right? And so I think the kinds of things that I'm doing when I'm doing my feminism, which is I'm always doing, aren't necessarily kind of relationships of conflict for me. I think I'm going to stop there. Is that okay? Did that answer your question? You are.
I'll think about it.
Oh wait, and also, sorry. There's a lot of more things. I have never derived more pleasure and more difficulty than being a feminist in this country, in the academy at this time. Right? So on the one, I am so energized and so excited and so animated and so I lie in bed sometimes, I'm like, look at these young feminists. Just look at how crazy they are. This is wonderful. But it's not always wonderful. Sometimes it's difficult. But I think it's worth the difficulty, and it's worth the risk, and it's worth the work we have to do. Yeah.
Okay, so I keep, of course, mentioning bell hooks, and part of the reason, of course, is that for me, I found myself in bell hooks. I as I was growing up, I would read. I occasionally read texts that came out of the subcontinent, but I didn't find myself in there. And it was really only when I started reading kind of black feminisms and African feminisms, and particularly Tsitsi Dangaremba, that I found that locationality of Africa and the kinds of weird and wonderful and tragicness that's in our lives. But last year when we had this decolonizing feminism conference at Wits, every second name was bell hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Audre Lorde, Amatu Aidu, Pumla Gqola, Yvette Abrams, Desiree Lewis, Molara Ogundupe. And so I was like, I don't even know what we're doing here. Like, feminism has been decolonized, and there's, of course, struggles and tussles that are still ongoing, but there's at least, a whole generation of people. If you didn't know who bell hooks was, if you didn't know who Audre Lorde was, you would have been at a loss, because you wouldn't know who 90% of the participants were speaking about. And I'm like, that's awesome, and of course it's because of the works of people like this sitting on this panel and many others across the country that have made names, bell hooks and Audre Lorde and Amatu Aidu part of the discourses that they teach. But an influential text alongside, bell hooks from the margin to the center for me was also Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Epistemology. So for those of you who don't know Collins, she's an African-American sociologist. And Betty introduced me to Black Feminist Epistemology, and it literally became my handbook, because it started to tell me all of the things like we were theorizing, we were doing, all of the stuff that that theory had taken, and Yvette has spoken about this, taken it and made it into this abstraction and made it inaccessible and made it divorced from our lives. Patricia Hill Collins was telling us, you're doing it already. Sociology needs to catch up with where you're at. And so I just love the kind of definitional text that it was, the kind of constructions that it created, the way it reflected on what Black feminist epistemologies were at that time. And the book came out like in 1990, and its focus was the US, but she was also dealing with various diasporas. And some of the tenets that she outlines include some of the following. So lived experience as a criterion for knowledge, the use of dialogue in assessing knowledge claims, the ethic of personal accountability, and Black women as agents of knowledge. And it has taken me something like 20 years for me to reflect this as a coherent practice, not just as like fundamental part of my life, but in my career, in my art making as well. And so I want to ask each of you how this kind of thinking in feminist practices, in African feminist practices, in Black feminist practices, how they have affected, what effect they've had, and how they play out in your various capacities as academics, as scholars, as creatives, and mentors, particularly in the kinds of settings that are not geared towards accepting these ways of thinking and validating these ways of thinking, and actually expect you to check this in at the door and then, go to Foucault. So I don't know. We like. I think it's gonna be Foucault bashing night. Okay. So we're gonna start with Betty. Okay. If you don't mind.
No. Lived experience is an ambiguous, or it tends to be boxed. So lived experience is experience on the ground, but that doesn't mean it precludes people in the academic world. We all, whether we're academics or not, we have lived experience. And I think for me, the theory that I have access to in the academy has, in a paradoxical way, sent me back to my lived experience. And so in a way, I was isolating and abstracting myself from my scholarship. That's how I was brought up, not to think of myself as a site for any kind of reflection. But over the years, and that's also linked to and influenced the kind of research I did. So being brought up in a colonial tradition, and then gradually reading all the theorists across the board, and made me begin to have a new understanding of lived experience. And so in many ways, I traversed the spaces of the academy, and which is my ground, and the other grounds on which I live and which I inhabit. And for me, it's just the most liberating, exciting experience. That's how my research on sister outsiders emerged. I would never have conceived of doing research. For instance, there's a whole chapter on my grandmother. She didn't seem, for me when I was growing up and even into my adult life, as a legitimate quest, as a story that was worth telling. And so much of the work I do is about women who don't get into the history textbooks. The story of the grandmother, my son-in-law's grandmother. But that's because we were schooled in a particular way of thinking of what is legitimate knowledge and what isn't. And so for me, it's a shifting ground. I'll stop there for now. Okay.
For me, a lot of what it means to include my lived experiences is to really trust that when I'm feeling something, that's a legitimate response, and that it comes from actually evidence-based observation, because I think there's so much science drummed into me that I'm always looking at, is there evidence, is it from me, am I just feeling this and delegitimizing that? But then, even science has caught up to that and said it's actually you're responding to enormous amounts of evidence that's coming from the environment. And this is in fact how we evolved, to give us a response to protect ourselves in that moment. And we may not, in that that moment, be able to deconstruct exactly why we're responding that way. And others may tell you you're crazy for responding that way. But really, pay attention to it. You can return with a different thing later if it's not legitimate, But for the moment, protect yourself and trust yourself and be confident enough to actually respond as your body is telling you and your emotional self is telling you. And together with that level, as you become confident in actually trusting your observations and the response it's producing in you, you also learn to draw boundaries and limits and articulate them kindly at first, stronger later, and in ways that are going to be seen as problematic and feminist and not nice. And so I also became very confident at not being liked at times, and that's okay too. I like myself, and that's really usually enough. And I have some friends who like me, and if they
says the person who has like 1,000 Facebook friends.
No, so then it's okay that you have a solid sense of who you are, your feet are on the ground, and if one of those people tells me I'm doing wrong, then I'll pay attention to it. But the rest of the world is another matter, and usually they're trying to manipulate you and mold you into something that's utilizable for their needs. And so those were my lived experiences that really informed me to, first of all, trust the thing that we call intuition as a place of epistemological creation. You know, this is a knowledge, and be confident to actually trust that.
And well, I've come sort of come very interestingly enough full circle. You know, when we started out, and I was working on my PhD thesis on Sarah Bartman, and was looking for theories through which to tell her story. You know, they were all there: Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, Hortense Spillers. They had a theory, and I think all the more because looking for black feminists on slavery, that was the only place to look. Really, and so it was very easy for, and I mean Pumla and Kabiba as well. I think there were just things that reflected through the analysis of, say, Angela Davis, race class and
Gender.
and gender. You know, just changed my life completely. And yes, particularly Hill Collins's ideas of ways of knowing, of experiential knowledge. I was like, wowie, you know, and I went with it. And interestingly now, 20 years later, I've come full circle, because for the past 3 years I've spent my time working on the epistemology of climate change. I mean, climate change in a sense is the utter ruin and bankruptcy of positivist epistemologies, right? Here with these scientists that we know it all, and they're managing to destroy the planetary ecosystem because they couldn't actually admit they know shit. So white male scientists don't have the moral high ground in 2017 that they had in 1997. In fact, what they have is an intellectual bankruptcy, because we kind of go, you should have listened to the Khoi. So we spent 500 years telling you it wasn't going to work. And look, it's not working. So, if there's ever a recommendation for staying alive and growing up to be an old feminist, you know, you get to say, I told you so eventually. Because of course Sarah Bartman was the original object on which a lot of this positivist epistemology was built. So, you know, I started my intellectual journey on the other side of the microscope, you know, and then spent 20 years turning the lens around and go, well, now that I scrutinize you, yeah, you really don't know shit. Hey, what are you going to do about sea level rise? Really? You know? But so in a sense, it's also her victory. When I finished my PhD thesis, I still hadn't said what I wanted to say, Beverly. I'd started off wanting to write the story of Sarah Bartman and didn't. I actually ended up writing the story of all the white men who wrote about her. And the minute I was done, I was like, okay, now I'm going to do the biography. I was like, yeah, you got to do the book, you got to do the book. But because I wanted to write a story about Sarah Bartman in the way that she would have written it, I got into indigenous knowledge systems. And after about 5 years of that, I realized actually she wouldn't have written a book at all. She would have grown a garden. So, and I've written about it in this Natasha Chipembere. So I promptly went and grew a garden. That took me 10 years. You know, and now I want people to see this garden that I grew in Homage. So there's her story. But so having gone from being the anti, the ha, you bunch of idiots, to, okay, fine, let me just do my thing. Let me just grow that garden. Let me just make Khoisan black soap. Let me just do the famous buchu oil. Actually, you won't believe it, Sharlene. I do say less and less as the years go on, because I feel, you know, I've moved beyond the need for words. So on that note, I'm going to shut up.
Silence by the silence.
Nothing.
No, Pumla, you're
I'm
not like
not
that.
quite sure what to say now. I've almost forgotten what the questions were.
Experiential.
Epistemology.
Black
feminist knowledge.
Black feminist epistemologies.
So, I teach this, one of the courses we teach is on writing gender in African. Jeez. It's called, what is it called?
Gender and writing.
And then in what? It has an in. Did we chop it off? Okay, I don't remember what the course is called. But it's called Gender and Writing. I think it's called Gender and Writing in African Literature. Or not. Anyway. And you know, several years ago when I started teaching this course, I inherited the course, but of course, because I'm not very good at inheriting things and just continuing. Like I'm not, following instructions is a very difficult thing for me. So anyway, so kind of teaching this course, one of the things that struck me that felt important for me in how to teach this course was around, as someone who, you know, as someone who kind of works obviously in a kind of a feminist literary tradition and an African feminist literary tradition, was what I was not able to do. So I was not able to teach this course as though in the kind of old-fashioned conventional way in which we trained into kind of English studies, right? Which is literary theory is something that you use in some instances to unlock knowledge out of creative text. But now I also was kind of faced with this task of introducing this thing called writing gender in African writing, and I didn't know how to just teach the novels and then bring feminist literary theory as though they were separate things, right? First of all, because that wasn't, even though that was technically how I was supposed to be taught and trained in English literary studies, that wasn't always how I was taught, right? So there were a few troublemakers who taught me not quite in this kind of conventional way of separating the things. So I didn't quite know exactly how to do it as separate things. But also because I just had this general difficulty with rules and approval. So I wasn't able to do it. And so it occurred to me that in fact it isn't really a sustainable and convincing project to teach them as though they're separate things, right? But even at the level of, not just at the level of kind of conceptual vocabulary, but even at the practical level, I couldn't account for, so if I had to teach, I don't know who, if I had to teach Buchi Emecheta, I didn't know how to teach Buchi Emecheta as those sociologists Buchi Emecheta and novelists Buchi Emecheta, and Buchi Emecheta who's organizing in Black Women's Publishing things in London with Loretta Ngcobo were not the same person, right? So I didn't know how to teach the thing where there's a conceptual vocabulary and there's a creative terrain in which to apply. So the relationships between practice, between the imagination and between, you know, were always kind of fuzzy, right? So they were never, the boundaries were always porous, So that was the one thing which I found uncomfortable, but a productive discomfort. But of course, in thinking about these kinds of writers and having to teach these kinds of writers who were also making other kinds of trouble in the world, who were not just becoming accomplished writers, but who were becoming I had to also reflect on my own relationship with kind of reading, right? Not just as a student of literature, but as a bookworm as a child, right? And to think about the fact that words were transformative. Reading was always transformative, right? That a big part of what I was taught was by things that were not supposed to teach me things, technically, right? If we have this notion that there's like the self-conscious, explicit prose, like non-fiction prose that teaches you stuff, and then there's creative text that are interesting and experiential and so on. And so I suppose thinking about creative theorizations, Sharlene, am I preempting?
That's fine. You're leading into the
A
next
little bit.
question. That's good.
Was inevitable, right? Because I didn't know how else to relate to creative living, but to be provoked and transformed, whether it came in the form of watching people who behaved badly and finding myself being drawn to people who behaved badly, or whether it was me reading a weird novel about things that were not supposed to, and learning things that I wasn't technically supposed to be learning from that novel. And so I suppose I'm battling, as you can see, with this, because I don't remember a time when those boundaries were so I feel as though almost perhaps this is the only inheritance that I welcome, right? That this kind of orientation to quirk, to kind of bad behavior, or to So I think that it seems so. What seemed unnatural for me then, as I was being trained into graduate life, was this separation, right? So it was a difficult separation for me to learn, right? This notion that the courses that were called theory was where you learned the stuff that allowed you to unlock the world, because creative texts were always doing that. And the girls at my school who were fighting with the teachers because they wanted to do woodwork were already doing something that changed how I saw myself and other people in the world, right? So I suppose for me then there is a connection between kind of creative theorization and living. And kind of life experience, not just mine, but also the life experiences that I have the opportunity and the honor, and sometimes the irritation of being witness, of being witness to. I don't know if I've answered your question at all, but that's what I have.
Okay, so you preempted two other questions, so I'm going to ask the other panelists to respond.
Oh, wait, you asked another question, sorry, about naming, which I didn't answer the first time. Look, I think this is probably the only thing I haven't changed on in 20 years. I think that names are important. I think what we call ourselves is important. I think that, and I think that sometimes it's, there's some things you like, okay, I'm okay to be called that thing, but I'm not necessarily going to call myself that thing. But I do think that names are important, and I think we come from a history that is not going to make that redundant. I think, I think that how we qualify our feminisms, when we qualify them, or whether we choose to use the word womanism, if we use it, is a political decision that is important and that is valuable and that we're going to revisit over and over again. Sorry, I just wanted to add that because I meant to say it earlier.
Okay, so you're talking also about how your kind of idea, how you creative theorization was intrinsic to your life from reading books and seeing how you learn stuff in there and finding yourself in there. And so one of the things I want to ask the rest of the panel is, as a child, what kind of creativities made an impact on you at that early age? If I think about my life, it was plasticine and horrible doilies, and which I hated, and my mother's atrocious love for porcelain dogs and fruit and porcelain.
Porcelain. Yes.
Yes. And so, if I hated them so much, sometimes I would break one, and my mother would piece them all together, so it was even worse. And so when I started to study art, it was like, no, we don't have art in our house. We don't deal with art, right? And then of course, as you grow up, you're like, oh, hold on, I have Chinese prints and Chinese cheap paintings, which my father picked up from dumps and put up on our wall. And so my mother was always making things, dolls and rag dolls and candles and flowers, and my father was doing welding and making gates for people. And so I realized actually that I was always surrounded by creativities. It's just that I didn't know that was creative. And so it took a long time for me to discover that. And so I don't ask this as a kind of an autobiographical question, but rather a question that's really wondering what kind of creativities you grew up in your home. And then, because each of you, your texts deal with creativities in such a serious way, serious is not the word, in such a loving way. I'm going to say loving, because there's love in it. And that love is shown through the critical reflection and the ways in which you tackle the works. So I want to ask what kind of initial impact creativity's had on your ideas of creative theorizations later.
It's interesting, but my creativity I derived from my dad, my father. My mother didn't sew and didn't do any of the handicraft type of work. My dad was an upholsterer, and I learned creativity from him. He made bags, I made bags. I still make bags. I knit, he knitted. And he sewed. He sewed for my mother, blouses and clothes for me. And he made underskirts and all of that. And I did the same. But I also thought, as Yvette was speaking, that I learned gardening with my dad. So I don't know if you know how one plants beans. And so they rose in the garden, mealies and so on. I would walk alongside him and put 2 little pea pods in a little hole, and I'd learned to cover it. And he would do, it became a kind of game that I played with him. But the joy of it, and I tell my grandchildren now, I asked my grandson, who's at Zimbabwe at the moment, I said to him, he's 5, I said, Adam, does sugarcane taste like a banana or an apple? My daughter said, Mom, that's a very unfair question. But the little boy said, a banana. And I said, but you see, it proves my point. This child doesn't know what sugarcane is. And we grew up in the North Coast. I come from Kersney and Stanley. I grew up with sugarcane. I knew how to identify a potato plant. I knew how to identify what we call monkey nut plant. I knew my dad would plant yellow ginger. What do you call this? The turmeric. Yes. There were rows of it, and it was a lovely row to the lavatory outside. We didn't have indoor toilets. And that was a kind of aesthetic development that I didn't realize at the time. Well, I rest my case. Yeah.
That's so true. I also learned gardening love from my father.
Yeah.
And my mum, who grew up very upper class in Colombo, in a city girl, had no interest in making her fingers dirty, as she said. But he loved it, and now we gardened in Zambia. Yeah. And so now that I own a home, I've started gardening, and my partner, who's from Bombay, has, he grew up in a high-rise where he has no clue what a garden is, so he wants to just plant things everywhere, and I was like, no, you need to plant in rows.
Yes.
And you don't understand. Rows are very important. You don't just hodgepodge junk together like that. It looks messy. And he's like, what's the problem? No. Rows are very important to this thing. And then, but he's got enough time. Symmetry of it. Yeah, symmetry is important, and he knows enough to move the beans to different parts of the garden to, put nitrogen into the soil. At least that charlatan's got it that much in him. But yeah, I think, for me, art for us came from the temple. We went to, my family is Buddhist, but some of them are also Catholic because we have Portuguese ancestors. And my grandfather converted during the period of nationalism when India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh came into being. And so we went to temple because it's around the corner. And before we moved to Zambia, when I was really little, I was in Sri Lanka. And so I remember walking to the temple, and the village monk stands at the gate, and he's like the biggest gossip. He knows everything because he's standing at temple walls, and then you go in, and the frescoes, just like in a church, you know, tells you the story, teaches you morality, teaches you many things. Because on the walls are these stories that tell you the lives of, supposedly the lives of the Buddha before he became the Buddha, because we believe in past lives, right? So each of them is a morality tale about something he did, and they're called Jataka stories. And they teach you, like, it's very bad to X, or, you know, like some kind of knowledge production in his life happened.
Like to ride a bike?
Not quite. Like things like, you know, the story is ostensibly about how the hare got put on the moon, but it was because a hunter was going to come and capture a hare, and what the Buddha did was to save the hare and sacrificed himself for the hunger of the hunter and put the rabbit on the moon to save him, and forever we remember that act of kindness and sacrifice too. And how sacrifice sometimes means yourself in service of others, right? So I resisted some of this, but also they taught you about who is dominant, because essentially some of these frescoes tell you about the fact that the ethnic group to which I belonged have the right of way on the island, this little contested place, and that here's the story that tells you that the Buddha gave this country to us and not to those other people, and he came as a civilizing force. Doesn't this sound familiar? And so as a child you're learning from these frescoes, which look like, you know, very harmless and very pretty nice pictures, and that's what I learned, that art teaches you about domination, about hierarchies, about social structures, gender, and also there are very problematic things about sacrifice. Because sacrifice
I just want to say that you were like saying sacrifice, you sometimes have to sacrifice yourself.
Yeah.
If it's not yourself, it's really murder.
Yes. It's very problematic.
That biblical story of, what is it, Isaac?
Isaac.
Abraham taking Isaac and
taken to
sacrificing. That's not sacrifice, that was murder, attempted murder.
Attempted murder. For nothing. He was hearing voices. I know. It's like, otherwise he'd be like schizophrenic, heard some voices and tried to kill his son. And then another voice told him not to. I mean, I find sacrifice to be deeply problematic, especially as a woman, because we're often called to sacrifice ourselves, put our labor to create and enhance the subjectivity of others. And I really don't want to do that. If it's shared labor, and sometimes I do something and other times you do something for me, and we both further ourselves, because there's sometimes skills that I have that you don't have, or time that I have that you don't have, and we do for each other, that's not a problem. But if my labor, my expertise, my time is being used solely to create you, your career or whatever, your ego, your presence in the world, that's a problem. So I find sacrifice to be violent to begin with. The idea of, you know, Jesus sacrificing himself on the cross, again another violent concept. So those are things that I learned from art, and they're very foundational, because I've been going since I was a baby to see those frescoes, and they're ancient things. And they're built upon again and again. And so art had a very, very significant place in my life, but I was always questioning some of that. And later in my life, I think my father was taking us to museums, and I remember he was saying, this is also a temple. And I think it's only, you know, later in my life that among other artists that I went to university with, that I began to think about it as a place in which one can have a conversation about how we think. And so, because I didn't produce art, visual art, I began writing about art, because it was a conversation for me, it's a text.
Wangari Maathai, who's the Kenyan environmentalist, and you all know her because she was Africa's first female Peace Prize winner, Nobel Peace Prize winner. Many many other things, but she writes about how the Kikuyu before colonialism would worship certain trees or certain springs, believing them to be the dwelling places of the ancestors, and so what we today would call environmental consciousness was built into the culture, and literally how they were taught certain forests on Mount Kilimanjaro could not be harvested, for instance, and she has this fabulous turn of phrase where she says, well, we Kenyans completely lost ourselves in that our politicians now behave as colonizers of their own people, which I think in South Africa in 2017 really. So I grew up a little bit differently because my parents were activists. They were adherents of Leon Trotsky, and real happy baby. And my only rebellion was to become black consciousness because there was nothing else that could shock them. It was that to Stalinism, it's hard, tough choice, but. And plotted armed struggle against the apartheid regime at a time when apart from Portco, nobody else was really doing that. And so they had to go into political exile in 1963. So I grew up in Sweden of the late 60s and 70s, long before, because most exiles were post-76. And post-76, I was almost on my way back. But so my parents had this fabulous opportunity of Sweden in the 70s to bring up the perfect socialist human beings. And their poor 3 children were like little experimental animals. Shame. It was interesting. I mean, I never heard the word colored until I came to Cape Town at the age of 21. I lived my entire life without knowing anything about these people. And I get back and I go, these people. Because they were bringing us up to be socialists. So we had no clue. In case you wonder, I ended up studying the Khoisan. It was kind of a need to root myself. But what was so fascinating was, and on top of it, for the first 6 years or so, my father had to redo his medical residency because the Swedes refused to accept an African degree, so he had to travel to wherever the residencies were. And so I grew up in little small Swedish mining towns in the very rural, where literally they'd never seen a real African in their entire life. Maybe on TV or on a poster, but an actual black person, was a new thing. And so to console myself, I'd go out into the Swedish forest and pick blueberries, or, it was very lonely because me and my mom were the only 2 black women in the entire town. Gee. So that's how, I knew I was black. That's one way you figure that out, right? Never had an option to not be black. But yeah, I grew up a bit of a hermit. But what was fascinating was my mother growing up this Damara farm girl in Sweden. So, she literally, the stories she would tell, the fact that she always sewed and knitted, like the notion of women's creativity as crafts, as arts you can use. These were formative influences, and this despite the fact that they insisted on us doing everything. My father took me to the opera. My mother made me play classical piano and violin. This was part of the broader program of the perfect socialist human. You had to be able to do everything a white kid could do, but do it better. I'd come home with better grades in Swedish than the Swedish kids, and this would just make my mothers weep. It was like that. So that was the overt message, but the subtext was around home and hearth and culture. She was your generation, she spoke 5 languages, 3 African languages, and it never occurred to there's something precious in that. So she brought us up to be, I only speak 3 languages, unfortunately, kind of went yeah, exactly, we kind of went backwards. And none of them are Khoisan to make it worse, because she didn't think that her mother tongue was something valuable to pass on to her child. But she taught me to garden, and that has become my life. You know, I'm not at all surprised I ended up making soap, because for me it's full body art. What do the different oils do for the body? Which oil do you pick depending on what you're doing? My research into colors, I mean, indigo, for instance. Indigo is a fermented leaf that it's in Africa. They've been fermenting this blue in Africa for at least 6 or 7 millennia. And I kick myself, because I'm like, you know, Stone Age people did this in Mali, and I can't figure out how to ferment this bloody indigo. You know? India as well. You know, everybody was fermenting indigo except me. And I feel like a but so that's because
show you.
Yeah, you know, that's how humiliating it is. Exactly, that's how humiliating it is. You know, with the PhD. But I need to go learn from a bunch of people in West Africa how to do this. You know, but so that has become, I think, my creative theorization. There's natural colors and natural canvases and you know, fragrances as a form of poem. The love in the midst of climate change, so it's frankincense, lemongrass, and ylang-ylang. And why does that particular concatenation of notes speak to climate and climate change? And so that's forced me to kind of go back to a very, very ancient culture that I didn't know I had, but that in actual fact has always been there.
Oh, wow.
You wanna
Okay.
add anything?
Huh?
You want to add anything?
You asked a different question.
Oh, I thought okay.
You asked what kind of creativity as a child.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the question I answered?
Yes.
No, you're fine.
But
Okay.
she's saying she doesn't want me to answer it. Okay, I don't have to.
Oh, she's saying that.
I even made notes like Neelika, so I could stick to the question this time. So I could actually stick to the question this time, not answer my own thing in my own head.
No, these are very nice notes on the hand.
Okay, so I mean, like you, Sharlene, I suppose various things. The doilies were very important, and I remember that it wasn't just the doilies. I mean, my mom was very kind of meticulous. They had to be starched a certain way. They had to be ironed a certain way. They had to be perfect symmetry. She didn't like floppy ones. She didn't like she had like 15 different size crochet needles for the different, like, whoa, there were blankets and there were doilies and they were tiny, and I mean, so there was that, and so there were the doilies, and then there were also the ornaments, right? Sorry, Mom. The hideous animals and like vases and right? I mean, some of the vases I now recognize are actually quite beautiful, but I remember as a child thinking the ornaments, because I grew up in this part of the world, and people call them ornaments. The ornaments. And you had to have the ornaments, right? And so we had ornaments, and and ornaments, and the kinds of ornaments you had, and how you rearranged the different sets. It was very so it was that stuff. But we also had, I think I remember from several friends' houses around Christmas, like you would decorate your house. Not in the way that the Americans do it, right? But I remember that everybody's house, like the roofs, the ceilings, the inside, there was like crepe paper, right? And some people were sloppy and they just went string. No. My mother didn't like simple like string. She had like specific, and of course the problem is that we had to do some of this labor of mixing the things. So she would cut them into, she had different colors and she would cut them into different designs, and then we had to mix the things, but, we hated it. I mean, I loved how it looked in the end, but I hated this thing of having to do useful work. No, I didn't like being useful. I've never liked being useful. But I did it because I kind of also I hated this work, but I also kind of was obsessed with my mother. So I did want, probably the only person's approval I've ever really wanted. So of course I would want to do this horrible thing that I hated that was being useful, but I would still have to do it perfectly, right? Because it would please her. So that was one side, but also bodies. I mean, I grew up I'm a child of the 70s, right? I was born in December 1972, and my parents were, so I grew up about 120 k's from here, in Alice.
Wow.
And because of Group Areas Act, my dad taught organic chemistry at Fort Hare. And because of the Group Areas Act, we lived on campus, right? The staff lived on campus. That's how universities got around, I don't know. Anyway, there was this loophole that universities used, and so staff lived on campus. And so I'm a child of the 70s, and what I remember often a lot about kind of the visual of that time is how much work went into body styling. So I remember stencils were a huge thing. I remember stenciled black fists on Fort Hare white walls with Black Power letters stenciled in. So the stenciled black fist and Black Power. So that's, my parents, I don't know if they're telling the truth, but until my dad died a decade ago, my parents would take great pride in the first English words our kids said was Black Power. I don't know, this was like their fantasy thing, but I mean, we will take it, right? So we keep it as their children. We're like, except my brother, Shane, who was born in the 80s, so. But the daughters, all of us like it, like the first English thing. This is how woke we are. Your generation thinks you're woke, let me tell you. So, there was a lot of that, those fists, and of course they would get painted off, and then they would reappear overnight sometimes. And the big big hairstyles, right? The elaborate kind of plaits and also of course as a girl child yourself then having to. So I remember the complete kind of splitting almost. Because on the one hand I would look at these gorgeous women with these kind of elaborate plaited hairstyles, as pineapples and flowers on their head, and I would want to be them. But I also knew what a nightmare it was to have to sit still between some CC's thighs on a Saturday and have my hair combed and plaited to look that beautiful, right? So I wanted to be them, but I was also like, Saturday, I just want to go play with peppers. I have to sit, and I had particularly difficult hair, right? So it was particularly painful, right? So that sense of like you want to look beautiful, and this is a big part of what kind of aesthetics is. That also, of course, are bell bottoms and platforms for men and women. So that's like the visual, you know, and the dashikis and the, you know. So that's a big part of my. And then, so that's my regular life most of the year. And then occasionally, every 3 months, my family would drive to Matatiele, which is where my maternal grandparents had retired to. So my mother was born and all her siblings grew up in Johannesburg, in Crown Mines. But obviously then my grandparents had to retire and go back, right? And we would drive Matatiele, and I hated it because it took too long, it was a nightmare. But the thing about Matatiele is that as we got to Matatiele, and as we drove to the village where my grandparents had retired, had gone back home to, which was not supposed to be my mother's home and her siblings' home, but except they'd never lived there because they were all kind of out of school by the time their parents retired. The houses, the people in Matatiele do this thing that they call Dineo, right? And at Christmas, all the houses have these exquisite patterns from different kinds of soils. And so you have hundreds, and you're driving and you're like, I just want to pee, I'm tired, are we there yet? I'm tired. But the houses aren't just painted. They're not like this part of the Eastern Cape with the jelly tots colors, right? They're not the jelly tots colors. They would be grays and browns, but they would be exquisite paint, like patterns, like almost murals on each house, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, like village. Then the village disappears, and then there's like an impossible way to drive through, and then, but it just, so I remember that and it's in fact, this is probably the only thing that I'm very nostalgic about, because we don't go there anymore. So that was one part, but that was specifically around December. So people would do that. I mean, of course, some people would be lazy and leave it all year, but they would be, they'd be refreshed every kind of December. So I associate that with this kind of dressing your house up, whether it's the crepe thing my mother did or the didema, that the people in Matatiele did. Yes, I think that's the bulk of it. And also then, I suppose, yes, crocheting was a big part of, a lot of my mother's friends knitted, but she had this crocheting thing. So, we all learned how to crochet, and it's like a thing, here, like Yvette, so whenever Yvette is knitting, I'm like, I don't know how to knit, I don't know how to knit, but I do know how to crochet. What else? And also, I suppose a lot of it was about kind of the stuff you do to your house, and stuff you do to your body. And then there were kind of non-visual things. Like the kind of all those records, all that music, and all that dancing. So I just my nostalgia is for like bell-bottomed, fancy-haired men and women with dashikis dancing to like those LPs, the little ones and the big ones, and the ones you scratched as a child and broke and hid. And what else? And then also last thing, sort of around words. My parents, reading is an important thing for them. But I also remember, of course, that my mother had this thing that she would color, like, because my brother came so late, and I had two sisters. Whenever we went anywhere, my mother had this thing until we were we were tweens. I had this thing that we all had to coordinate outfits. So she would coordinate. So it would be a pink day, and she would and then we'd all have, it would be a red and white day. And so I suppose, So all the girls would have to wear like some version of, she would wear the grown-up fancy version, and we would wear like, So, but we always had to coordinate when we were dressed up. And so kind of the body then as this, see? When I take notes, I stick to the question.
There's times when you don't realize that your family was, had a sense of aesthetic sensibility until you read something like In Search of Our Mother's Gardens.
Yes.
You don't recognize what our mothers were doing, what our grandmothers were doing. And for us, a lot of it was at the dinner, at the table, like whatever we had, it had to look beautiful.
Oh, yes.
And present what you have beautifully.
Absolutely.
And to this day, I go and collect china from like old ladies in the US. You can buy them like $5 and you get a china set that somebody doesn't want because they're buying something new every other day. And you find this like beautiful china that my mother would have died for. I know. And then you can just it might just be like whatever you have that day when you serve it on that beautiful thing. It's just a nice day.
Absolutely. And Neelika's Facebook pictures are amazing because she has these exquisite. And I just want to live there.
Do you know why I learned to cook? Because I was an immigrant and ain't no mum around or dad around to cook for me. So as an immigrant, you learn to cook. And also I was a poor student. And I worked under the table, like illegally, at a French pastry shop. And so I was telling in the morning, like I woke up at 4 o'clock, went to the pastry shop, we baked bread, and made the pastries. I went and swam, went to class, and none of my cohort was like drinking, and they couldn't even get up by 10. But meanwhile, I'd been making pastry, and it gave me a degree. So, but it also, it's a continuation of your aesthetics, and also how you can provide hospitality for a person who comes to your home. As long as they're not an ass who's expecting you to cook for them, though. Okay. Yes. That condition is there. Yes. There has to be an exchange of labor, expertise, and time.
And I wanted to just add that my dad, I just recall now, we had a wooden iron home on one of our early homes, and the kitchen had just shelves where you put all your enamel ware and what have you. And he had the knack of folding the newspaper and cutting out dolls. And it was just always done perfectly. And you ended up with a row of, it's very much like this, a row of, so this is I make art. And I always tried to imitate my dad and tended to lop off one or two at the ends because you have to know how to fold the paper correctly and the right size. And then what he did was shape the girls, the dolls, and then they would be there. And he would teach this to other members of the family. Do you know about this, where they do this with the newspaper?
Yes,
It was
I've seen other people.
old newspaper.
Yes.
And I must say, I always admired it.
That's so sweet.
It was amazing, yes. And of course, he also made goodries. This is a heavy duvet that you will really need in a Grahamstown midwinter. And it's not healthy. It's not like your light featherweight duvets.
No.
It's one of those duvets that you are really crushed under its weight. But my dad used to add all these layers and make them. And incidentally, when Ahmed Kathrada was in Robben Island, he was talking about his longing for the Indian delight, and he said he didn't want to tell his fellow friends to reveal his Indian identity. He was longing for a goodri. And that goodri is exactly this. It's this heavy duvet that you
Self-made.
make.
Yeah,
It's
homemade,
made.
yeah.
Homemade, yes.
So, following on from that, I want to ask you what you think I feel like there's a resurgence in an understanding and an emphasis on imagination. And I wonder if it is particularly in regard to world events at the moment, where it does seem, on the one hand, like our imaginations have been hijacked. At the same time, it's giving birth to a lot of creativities. And I say our imaginations have been hijacked because at the conference someone was saying here about the realities of decolonizing universities, like the economic impact, what that means. And my response was, we can't have people who cannot imagine free education leading the discussions on free education.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Yes.
We can't have people who can't imagine gender equality defining the discourse on gender equalities. We cannot have had people who couldn't imagine racial inequality in this country in the 80s. Then leading the discussions on racial equality in as much as 5 years after that. So there is this kind of hijacking of our imaginations that says this is not possible. And at the same time, there's also, I think, this new resurgence where people are saying, I'm not believing those rhetorics. That are saying, if I can believe it, then it's possible. And there's degrees of possibility. And so I want to ask you about whether you think the imagination can be a political critical force, and how so?
Well, Sharlene, you move me. I'm about to stand up and say, rah, rah, rah. But for a long time, I said, because the past few years I've been focusing more exclusively on questions of knowledge and knowledge creation. And what has fascinated me is how does creativity emerge? What social circumstances, what historical circumstances, what conditions of labor or voluntary work creates a particular concatenation of creativity. And this is precisely because I'm trying to study the emergence of new sciences or new ways of approaching the notion of scientific thinking, but also very old ways. If it's any comfort, because of climate change, and I've written about this since about 2010, the capitalist economy is collapsing. We're way past worrying what's going to happen to the economy, because the economy is pretty much nach anyway. You may have noticed that we haven't grown since 2008, and we're now in a negative growth rate, along with the rest of the world. So I share your concerns around what are we educating young people for? when the predictions are for anything from 2 meter to 12 meter sea level rise by 2050, these are the people that are going to have to fix that. We're going to be dead. If you're talking about the collapse of the internet, please stop hyperventilating. When you talk about the collapse of the internet or the collapse of this global, they all start hyperventilating. When the internet goes, what are you going to do? I'm sorry, but your faces are priceless. In fact, I used to love science fiction, but I've stopped reading it because it's uncomfortably like reality. And the fact that we have a university system that's not even asking the questions, never mind preparing the youth for what we have done, but is not even educating them to ask the questions, is shameless. It is such an act of genocide, spiritually, intellectually, and physically. I mean, I just published on my Facebook 2 days ago the predictions for global famine within the next 10 years. Why are they not teaching that at this university?
Because they're too busy debating, are you reading Shakespeare?
Oh, no!
This way?
You know, what does Foucault really exactly?
Yeah.
So these debates are completely irrelevant in the face of what's actually happening. But they're wasting your bloody time with it because they cannot imagine a world in which white supremacy does not rule.
Or doesn't even, it's not even relevant.
Exactly.
It's not relevant.
But okay, but
So
let me
to get
contest
back to
you
your
on that.
question.
No, but let me contest you on that. I think the possibility of a world without white supremacy is nagging at their consciousness. That's why there's such a backlash of right-wing supremacy. I think that's bubbling under the surface.
Well, that's actually very interesting, you know, and now we're getting distracted, but maybe not. Because for years I thought to myself, one day they're going to wake up, like Archbishop Sutu says, there's no planet B. One day they're going to wake up and realize they're not getting onto that spaceship. The only people that are getting there are those 62 billionaires who bought a ticket. The rest of them are going to be stuck here on Earth with a bunch of very angry natives who are going to want to know, what the fuck have you done to our planet? You know, so I thought, now they're going to come round. They're going to come round because they know they're not going to get away. They're going to be forced to figure out how. But in actual fact, what's happening instead is, like you say, this ultra, they're going back to that, they're getting worse. I'm like, okay, so no more neoliberalism, no more globalization, no more pretense. Now it's just like outright white supremacy. You know, like people say, this is a rehearsal for The Handmaid's Tale. Well, so it is. Yeah, and that, I think, deserves, some political science needs to explain that to me. So I don't think we're actually really disagreeing in you know. But yes, some few are kind of realizing, like Dean Hutton says, at this point we've got to walk away from whiteness, you know, because it's just as a survival strategy. So lots of people question like what she does and what she says, but I do think she at least has a sense of realpolitik. You know, guys, there's no planet B. And if they were, they're not letting you on the spaceship. Okay. Moving swiftly along.
Even if you have a Rhodes degree.
Even if you have...
And it still says Rhodes in 50 years.
And in actual fact, the spaceship may be leaving pretty shortly, and you are going to be stuck here with us. Okay. So just as long as we're all clear about that. Now I've completely forgotten.
Imagination.
So,
As a site of...
how are we going to imagine the future? How are we going to teach you who are stuck with the melting of the polar ice caps and the extinction of the Great Barrier Reef to deal? And if we say, okay, white supremacy is in a lot of ways a distraction and a side issue, what does that mean? So we figure out what we don't, what do we like? What are we for? How is it, and is this not the historical juncture at which we should be devoting ourselves with every fiber of our being to stimulating the creative imagination, because without it, we are going to go extinct. So once again, I apologize for my generation and the generations before me. We didn't know we were fucking up the planet, we black middle class with our carbon emissions. But I'm really sorry. I'm doing my best to fix what I can while I'm still around. But at the end of the day, you are going to have to come up with these solutions to problems that we can barely even begin to imagine. So how do we create the material conditions, the psychological conditions, the confluences of ideas and flows that are going to bring forth our best in creativity? Those are the questions that I'm dealing with at the moment, and this is why I'm not shutting up. I have for the past couple of years been working on, using arts and culture as a way to bring across the message of climate change, because as you can see, only 2 of you ever read my papers, but a lot more people relate to the arts. So last year I executive produced a play in Vrygrond, with a youth club. So having the youth do plays around climate change for the youth, and this year I'm executively producing this movie, in which unfortunately I'm in. It's a bit of a mind mess to be executively producing something you're actually in. Exactly. You get my drift. You see exactly what I'm saying. But when I started, I did not know that this is the first documentary on climate change to be produced and directed and filmed and written by black women. I was like, it's 2017. I wrote to all my academic friends, Beverly Guy Shiftel and this, and all you cultural studies people saying, can't be right. Somebody, they can't be that backwards. And they all go, actually. My research showed me there's one Kenyan woman that's done 1/5 of a documentary, and that was a British woman who produced 5 countries, and in every country she let a local person direct. And that's it. So back to the very old feminist questions around voice, around material conditions, of the mere fact that we had to raise money to do this documentary, because... But so who's been telling the stories about climate change? Who's been in front of the camera? Who's been behind? So once again, kind of coming full circle. But so all I can say, Sharlene, I think that is the right question to ask. That's the key question. We need to be asking, how are we going to make these young people be geniuses? And how do we create the social circumstances that make that happen? That other stuff, it's fluff. It's a sneer and a delusion. Sorry.
Why are you saying
okay, I'm going to shut up now.
No, I agree.
By the time I'm done, she's like, is this woman never going to shut up?
No. I'm actually going to say only a little extra. I mostly agree. I just don't. I think that imagination is the only way we can create freedom. Unlike Yvette, I'm not so optimistic that we can teach these young people, right? Because I think, in fact, that is both what's hopeful about this moment and what is clear about, if indeed what we take for granted is failing us, is failing this generation, is failing us, is failing humanity, then perhaps we shouldn't, perhaps the invitation to the imagination requires that we recognize that this is something we can't teach. Because how are we going to teach what we don't know?
True that.
Right?
Yeah.
We can't teach what we don't know. And in fact, what we need is what we need desperately at this point is the courage and the capacity to imagine the counterintuitive. That's what formalism is. We couldn't have imagined it. We could do transformation to a certain point and then, right? But it couldn't work beyond a certain point, right? So you had to have Rose Must Fall, you have to have Feet Must Fall, but it's we couldn't have imagined it. With the best intention, the most radical of us could not have made Rose Must Fall happen. And when we were at UCT and pouring all that paint on the statue, that was as mad, and then they would take it off and we'd pour something and we'd take it off. We wouldn't have, So I think that the imagination is the only thing that can get us out of a whole range of things. But I think that also the imagination, what the imagination in movements, in the new forms of movements, and in the kinds of things that this generation is disillusioned with, shows us precise. And I mean, one of the things that's so animating for me is this, and it's a thing, of course, that you all get shot at for. Sorry. This is why you're getting shot at, right, by my generation and the generation before me on campuses. Because in fact, you're not beholden to any of the things that any of the systems of thinking about freedom that we inherit, that we take for granted, that was passed on down to us, right? And so you're saying, I'm sorry, but we're not doing only politics along our silos of student organizations. You're saying, you know what, we've figured out something that didn't even occur to you. We're going to work across. And we don't want to protest against financial exclusions. In fact, we realize that it's important to do that. For a while it didn't work. We didn't get it. We got it like we would get like that year we would win, and then the next year it would happen again, and every January we'd have to do the same protest against financial exclusions. And you said, you know what? No. This thing we've been doing it, it doesn't work. What you actually need is to smash the whole fee structure. You had to imagine that. It's counterintuitive. It was counterintuitive 4 years ago to think, actually, that's what you need to do instead of, and I'm just using things that are already happening. But those are projects of the imagination to organize across political formation, student political formations that don't like each other, that don't agree, is unthinkable for students of my generation, right?
Yeah, we fought each other.
It is unthinkable, but that is the imagination, right? Outsourcing, I mean, please, we tried to resist outsourcing when it was happening, and we failed. And it's taken you what? Fees must fall, redo 2. And most universities have been forced to have been, and so I think imagination is, and sometimes we think about imagination as in this country where there's the dominant culture is for such is to think about imagination with such contempt, right? And you see it also in the treatment of those things that are called the arts, right? Every year after elections, somebody says, who's going to be the minister of arts? The person we don't want can go do that funny portfolio, or like the person we need to shut up, or something like. Just take the unwanted portfolio, right? And I mean, that's just one thing. But it actually reflects so much of the orientation of, which is strange for organizations and movements that had cultural desks, that said art for art's sake, that recognize the enormous transformative power of the imagination. To then say, just escapist, what are you doing? And so I think that, I think on the one hand, I think we come from people who've always recognized that you cannot have freedom without imagination. And that freedom comes with imagining the counterintuitive. But maybe that's exactly why we're so stifling. Maybe that's exactly why the people who are in power today, that we put in power, I say we collectively, not me, put in power, have such contempt and such control and are so dismissive towards the arts, because they know exactly what the imagination can do. And they recognize that in fact what is happening in the visual arts and literature and music is not separate from smashing structures and redefining how institutions work. And so I think this is the time for the imagination. I think this is the time to break those boundaries and to recognize that they're connected, right? That the counterintuitive and the imaginative is connected. That you get what I'm saying. Why am I telling you? You're the ones who know this.
She even stood up.
She did. I just wanted to agree so much with Pumla and to pick up on the word that Yvette used, confluence. And I wanted to add to the contribution that you made. I myself traverse, as I said, different spaces. I also work very much and experience spirituality. My parish is named after St. Aidan, and if you know anything about Celtic spirituality, it's very much spirituality on the ground. It's about the universe, about the earth, Yvette about the
The
cosmos.
council matriarchs.
Yes, and it's very syncretistic, very much in the tradition of African spirituality. But my point is that the imagining and the imagination traverses the sacred and the secular spaces. And art does this. Art and poetry do this in such deep ways and moving ways. And my longing and my wish is that science, and I'm not stereotyping science, but science understands as well the role of the imagination. So when I read someone like Richard Dawkins, and I insist on reading him, I see how the imagination eludes him. And I think of about the university research forms and the linear, rationalistic way in which you have to prepare your research proposal and all that goes with it. Where's the imagination there? And yet, Push is doing work. Her methodology is questioning all the state received methodologies. We train our PhD and master students to follow. And for me, it's a denial of the imagination. The kind of work we do in our arts world is contrary to the way in which the institution understands the role of the imagination. The scientists don't understand this. And so for me, this is my plea, this is my cry. How can, and Arundhati Roy's talked about the end of the imagination. It cuts across, and it's because of the end of the imagination we have war. And we're having the crises of refugees and all of that. It's not just about an arty world that's separate from the real world. It's about an inclusive world.
Absolutely.
When there's the end of the imagination, that's the end of our world.
Yep.
And the imagination also in addition, in
Drops my picks up.
if you believe in God, it's also about how we imagine a deity or God or gods. If you've seen the film Silence, it's by Martin Scorsese. It's set in Japan in the 16th, 17th century. It's about the persecution of Christians, but it's about martyrdom and so on. But at the end of the day, when you read that book, it's really about how do you imagine who God is. And the novel and the film is called Silence. But God is silent. God is folded, was watching humans with these arms or her arms folded. God is silent. But what does that silence mean? Not withdrawal, but allowing humans to make sense of their existence. Giving humans, that's the freedom we have. And how much of human civilization and history has foregone that right. The right to imagine what it means to live together as a global family, the right to write history, the right to imagine who God is. God sits and watches humans with these arms folded. That's the silence. And what are we doing with the enormous freedom that we have? What are we doing?
So I think
Does that
we're
make
also-
sense?
Yes. We're all probably very, very exhausted. And I think there's a moment in which your imagination isn't able to work from exhaustion. That can be a very political thing, but it can be just a real practical thing of like we've been talking, thinking, interacting for the whole day, and our imaginations often fail us at those moments. And it's a good thing to listen to that moment. So I'll give up, you know, I don't need to give up anything because everything wonderful has been said. So if we should break.
Okay, so I'm not going to keep you much longer. I do have 2 more questions.
There's two more.
Wow.
I was thinking.
I'm going to do them together.
You know she works as hard.
Oh no.
Hey,
I was like,
I don't often get the
I was telling her, let some people go.
This
This Pharaoh won't let people go. But please.
We have wine after this.
Oh.
stage for all the creativities that's coming. So my two last questions I'm going to roll them into one. So, you know, going through Black, African, post-colonial, feminist ideas around creative theorization, you see certain features that are foregrounded. The fact that you have women of color-centered narratives that are produced by women of color artists who seem to be addressing their own communities but not necessarily limiting themselves to it, but that addressing their own communities permits a dialogue that is nuanced. And rather than and refutes this objectification of their work and their bodies. Also, the use of autobiography as the intersection of larger social history with personal family histories, the everyday as a site of theorization, particularly in regard to the intersectionality of oppressive and affirmative practices, the use of the black body as a site of performative interrogation, differences and contradictions as fundamental in theorization to show the heterogeneity of women of color's lives, the value of the emotional as a form of knowledge, and ethics of caring and personal accountability. You know that much maligned word, love? Yes, yeah. And I wanted to ask you, how do you define creativity? How can creativity be critical, but also sometimes when we say creative theorization, people automatically think it's theorization about creativity, and they don't go on to think about the fact that theory is creative, and this is where our universities have really been sinful in removing and stifling the kind of creativity that emerges that gives birth to theory. And so I wanted to ask that, but also another question that I wanted in relation to that, or maybe it's not in relation, I'm just putting that question in, okay? In recent years, there's also been an acknowledgement of our fictive emotional lives, and that we need to attend to those and to the kinds of affectivities and identitarian fictions we create for ourselves. And what Bell Hooks calls the fact that we need to give birth to, we need to enjoy critical pleasure. And you know, Dineo mentioned that, and you mentioned that as well, that pleasure is important. We don't have to justify it, but that pleasure itself can be critical. And again, when we talk about imagination being hijacked, we've let popular culture, the Hollywood industry, and hip-hop, and a whole lot of other people steal that platform. And so how can we use creativity to indulge our critical pleasures, but at the same time, we remain critical?
So, I want to, maybe one of the things that I would say, really, creativity doesn't happen really without a curiosity that needs to be present for creativity to work around what drives you. There has to be, something is curious and you are inquiring. And that practice was very much part of science too, because how did Copernicus risk his, life? You're curious, you know something isn't right about the way the world is being told to you at the time, and you will risk your life. That to me is so powerful about creativity. Is like that there are times that this drive in you, this curiosity in you, that drives you to search and inquire, which we call also creativity, is so strong that it's stronger than your drive for physical survival. I think, and for justice, those things have been strong in me since I was a little girl, and there was no word like feminism existed. I just knew this is not what I like, this is not the way I want to be, and I wanted to inquire into other ways of being. It's a driving force in all of our lives, whether it's about finding beauty in our everyday lives, in our garden, on our table, in the beautiful attire you put on, the decorative person that you present yourself as every day. I know I'm looking at all of you, all of us, and those are ways of being in the world that are healing and deeply threatening to those who want to shut those imaginations down, your curiosities down, the ways in which you inquire about the world, whether it be through science, be it through art, through literature. So expect that resistance, because that those are things that resistance goes together with people who are free enough to inquire, and your drive to find your freedom is so strong that there'll be as much resistance to it.
I think that creative theorization is multi-dimensional, and they all come together. So creative theorization is embedded in it is an ethical caring. So this is where, for me, there's no split between the academy and the work and the transformation work and agenda we have in the academy and outside. So often we've separated them, and you're quite right about, Yvette mentioned this, about us harvesting stories and experiences and the performances and the art, but then it's presented in journals that research rated, and it's fine to do that, but how is this then filtering back to the people from which it emerged? And so in what ways creative theorization, reading the world, understanding the world in the Freudian sense, but also as part of the attempt to change the world. So it all is part of the same project. So there's a place for academic theorization and creative theorization, or even if it's not in the academy, for this kind of extended, developed thinking and critique of the world. And we thank the Foucaults and everybody else who helps us to read the world in a critical way. And so we draw from that. How is that kind of project helpful in making the transformation project happen? And I think if we can keep these strands interconnected and constantly in conversation, you have a feminist revolution taking place all the time. We can change the world. It's just that we've compartmentalized our work, the performance work, the artwork, the writing, and there's nothing against writing and publishing and so on. But how is that connected to the way? Why is it that when Yvette said, and it's so true, that people don't understand academic writing? How many people understand what Judith Butler's really saying about how we should live in the world? And I think that's the challenge. So it's all very well to use the discursive language that we acquire. And it's amazing how our students are into the whole discursive language. It's really very encouraging. And the new discursive language compared to the language we used when I was a student, that's liberating. But those words have a meaning on the ground. And how do we understand it?
So for me, sorry, I'm going to skip Yvette.
I
Yvette,
wanted
can
to
you
jump
have the
in.
last word? No, can you have,
I've also
no.
got a question for you.
Okay, go ahead. I'm going to let you bully me. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm bullying.
I think
Pumla
we've known each
because
other
I'm
long
older than
enough.
her, so
Not because you're older than me. I'll take it back.
I am older than you.
Not because you're older than me. Not because you're older.
But you use the soap, that's why you look so good.
Thank you.
I'm going to start.
Sharlene, you asked the most lovely questions.
I know.
Really, this is so
Oh, yeah.
usually when you go to a panel, it's just some rubbish.
I must really say that.
You should see. Like, if you saw this on the email, it was frightening.
The questions
I sat down
are
and typed because I was scared.
That's why she had notes.
Memo notes.
So for me, the act of creating new knowledge is exactly the same as the act of creating new art, and that distinction itself is a post-enlightenment, is an enlightenment distinction.
Yeah.
And this is why, like Wednesday, I was giving this presentation. I said, I could never have done my work at a university because a university would have asked me to write papers about indigenous knowledge systems, not actually practice indigenous knowledge systems.
Yes.
University would have invited me to a conference on decolonization, not actually decolonizing my skin. Or like doing stupid things like taking a hectare of land and restoring the original vegetation and putting in biodiversity. It wouldn't have like gotten me tenure. So with the greatest of respect for you that have stuck it out, the fact of the matter is that to generate that kind of knowledge is you're either going to have to break down the walls of academia and go do it in the townships, or you're going to have to bring the townships into academia. But to get back to a situation where creative theorization, and if you study this, you'll see this. The art that was there at the time of Fanon, the music that inspired Biko, it's always been like that. It's just about how do we consciously build it. So I guess that would be my question to you, Pumla. If you're saying we've got nothing to teach these youngsters, what should we as educators then be doing?
Learning from them, man.
I'm not saying we have nothing to teach them.
So what exactly are you saying?
I'm saying we are not the ones to teach them how to, there are things we can teach, but what we cannot teach is exactly what is their imagination to get out of this mess. Otherwise, not imagination. Then we can train them into stuff, and we can teach them what we know, but we can't teach them what we don't know. And what's going to get us out of here is going to require something we haven't yet discovered. Because if we had discovered it, it would be redundant. It would be out of here.
But that's the perilous journey.
But
we take, and our students take.
Yes.
Yes.
That's why we stay.
That's the role of
because we
imagination.
invested.
And that's the imagination.
Yes. But also, Sharlene. I'm tired now. My mouth is like. So, Sharlene, you say.
My notes.
I know. I'm Neelika's people. You say. When we think about creative theorization, we have to think about the fact that theory is creative. Yes. But for me, and I think for you, but for me also what we often forget to say, but that is crucial for me, is to think about how the imagination theorizes. So not only is theory creative, but the imagination is theoretical. Right? And so what does it mean? So not just that I read, and I love them, Derrida and Fanon, and but also to recognize that there's something that reading Manika allows me to do. There's a way in which reading Sarala Dipo Manika allows me to do something that has nothing to do with literature. Right? So to think seriously about what does it mean if encountering a self-consciously and explicitly creative text allows you to think outside of that space in ways that are indebted to what you learn in that space, right? So if we think about what is theory for, what do we use? Think about what we use, the theory that we know is theory, that we talk is theory, as our imaginations get disciplined into the disciplines, right? And sometimes the imagination gets disciplined. Part of the training is training you out of being imagination. Right? So and also we live in a country where discipline, people think saying, you're a disciplined kid is a good thing. Like, what we need is inner discipline.
You need some form of structure.
Structure is different from
discipline and structure are not the same thing. Although they often are, depending what structure, whose organization. So sometimes they're not the same thing. But I'm just saying that part of what we have to recognize is that in fact part of our training into academia is often not just in academia, in school. Part of educating, and this is the lineage that we inherit. It doesn't matter that once upon a time we had histories of educating differently, right? That's not where we are. We are in 2017, and the dominant ways in which we define education aren't. It's very nice that in 12, 13, if I was sitting here, I would have. Well, I don't know what those things were. What I know is that we all are now sitting in the shadow of a colonial education, right? And that's what's dominant. Not that in 12, 13 we had our own schools. That's very nice. But what were our own schools? We don't know. We know what this is, right? And how that part of colonial education, part of the function of English literature, part of the function of colonial education is to educate you away from something, right? And to discipline. So education as a discipline. So when we say that disciplines, it's not an accident, right? It is like an army for your mind, right? And yes, it comes with paradoxes, right? And my training is in English literature. You think this is the terrain of the imagination, but if you think about English colonialism would be impossible without English literature. It would be impossible. And the fact that we don't know what that means speaks to how effectively it's been able to do that work while not being explicit about doing that work, right? So, and it doesn't mean that we didn't have other literatures. That's besides, like, you're missing the point. If you thought, but we had other ways. It's not the only way we've been. Yes, nobody's denying that. But the point is, if even those disciplines that are about the imagination have fundamentally come to us as a way of training us out of imagination.
Wow. And every time...
Then we have to think about, and the thing is, that's been creative theorization too, right? Not in our favor, against us, right? So it's taught us how to be, and hopefully most of us are not, which is why we're able to do this nonsense that we do now, right? We haven't quite succeeded in being fully, properly colonized subjects we were supposed to be.
Yes, thank God.
They failed.
Right? So, well, I'm not with everybody. There certainly are the people that should have been trained into that didn't manage to be. Right? We've certainly encountered them, and you encounter a lot of them in my discipline, just all over the world too, not just in South Africa. So this thing. So when we say when African feminists say over and over and over again, when Sharlene says it over and over and over again, in words. And when she's sewing and she's showing, in her earlier body of work, in her earlier bodies of work, it's not some crazy thing that we wish was true in the world, right? It's, and perhaps those of us who trained in disciplines that are enamored with, that study, that take seriously the creative, even if they're dishonest about the harmful ways in which creative genres can also theorize. So we're not saying that creative theorization is always a freeing project, but we're talking about investing in, so we recognize that the creative texts always theorize, right? Even though part of our training into academy is to pretend that they don't. So you need lit theory courses, you need art theory courses in order to process this thing that's supposed to be a raw product. But what we're saying is that this thing that's supposed to be a raw product already theorizes. And so how do we think about how it can theorize? We know how it's theorized us into this ugly mess. But how do we think about those creative sites, those creative texts, those creative practices, those creative sites that theorize in ways that enable us, that bring us closer to the other thing, to a world that is for us, right? So we know what it's like, what it's created, what creative theorization does at its most destructive. But part of our investment as African feminists in creative theorization is not some decadent crazy thing that people like Pumla and Sharlene and Neelika and Betty and Yvette because we are the people we are with we cultured middle class, over-educated folks.
You speak for yourself.
Sorry, PhD is the definition of over-educated. So part of what we're saying is, look, this is what creative texts do anyway, right? And what work does it do to pretend that they don't? What violent work does it do to pretend that they don't? And who is served by the violent pretending that they don't? Not me. Right? And so it's in the interest of an African feminist project, which is why we're so annoyingly repetitive on this in different ways. We like keep right, no creative theorization. You're all like, what the hell are they on again? This thing that's really the project. That's the project that creative texts theorize. And they create world and they do these things, but the how and the what and what they're theorizing and what they enable us to do matters, and we are invested in them doing a certain kind of work. And creation, because they're always creating something that is the opposite of this mess, or not the opposite, but something more interesting than the mess and that for me is creative theorization. It's not so much, theory is creative, that's nice, it's already theory. It's okay, everything is creative. But for me, the more important thing is, what happens? What am I able to do when reading Kolega Putuma or watching Gabriel Goliath? What am I able to do that happens in my head that changes how I relate to my children, that changes how I relate to where I work, that changes who I bank with, that changes what organization I work with differently, that changes how I walk in the street, that changes, that changes what kind of politically transformative project I invest in. And it's not just Foucault who teaches you that, right? It's not just the stuff that's called theory, full stop. It's creative sites that propel us to do that and to be different in the world. And so how to invest more in what that risk is. And it has to be risk. I have nothing else, Sharlene. I'm depleted. Are you sure?
Okay.
No.
Creative theorization, by definition, is about giving birth to something that doesn't exist. So it's rearranging what you've inherited and reconfiguring it, but it's also about imagining, and that's the imagination, imagining something that was not conceived and it was not in existence before. And that's the exciting thing about it. And it can take place in a piece of art. It can also take place, as I said earlier on, in the kind of work we do in the academy. So this book I'm reading, I don't know much about blues and jazz, but I think about this world and I think of how improvisatory it is, how the role of the imagination is foregrounded in this. Here's this book by Angela Davis. I showed it to Sipho Kazi. It's Blues Legacy and Black Feminism, and it's actually practicing what Patricia Collins is saying about subjugated knowledges. So here are the blues artists, Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, people you would know. They didn't come with any theory about creative theorization. They just were.
But they did, Betty.
But no, but that, I'm coming to that. But in so many ways, their lives enacted it. Their lives enacted the creative theorization we're talking about. So the way in which they wrote these songs and the way in which they read the world, the slave songs and so on, all of this came out of a project of creative theorization, although they didn't use that language. So we need to trust that creative theorization occurs and the role of the imagination continues, whether it's detected or not. We need to believe that it exists and that we will see a transformed world.
I feel like this is the plot for The Matrix. Thank you for staying with us. I just, that day I knocked on Betty's office, I was really scared because, academics are busy. But more than that, black women are overloaded. They do so much work in their academies that are never acknowledged. So to knock on a black woman's door and say, "Help me, I'm drowning right now," was changed my life in that I found somebody who said, "I don't care how busy I am, I'm still going to help you." And all of these women here have such busy lives. And for them to come and take time out of their lives and come here in the cold to Grahamstown, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for making time available and for the generosity of thought for which we know and love you. And so, and for all of you for attending and staying late. I know this was a long session. I want to thank you. Our program now is that shortly, in another 10-15 minutes, we're going to have a book launch. It's not going to be long. And the opening of the exhibition, and then we're going to have poetry performances by Betty, by Sipokazi Jonas, and some performative performances by Heidi Singuba, Kwezi Zungu, and Erin de Kock. Just to note, Heidi's presentation and Sipokazi's presentations will happen in this space, so they will ask you to come back in here. Heidi's presentation is just 6 minutes. Erin's presentation and Kwezi's presentation, you're not expected to stand there. They will be performing for an hour. You're not expected to stand and watch it for an hour. There's food, there's wine. Please indulge and take care of yourself. Thank you very much.